Hello and welcome back to The Way of the Shark Redux, my extended, rewritten and re-recorded deep dive into and critical analysis of ground fighting, submission grappling and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Three names that can mean the same thing but don't always. On this particular show we'll be looking at the claim that all fights end up on the ground, that notorious claim made by the Gracies and supposedly supported by a law enforcement report that was made in the late 1980s, and a critical review that was made of that particular report. And with regards to critical reviews, we'll be looking at the controversial arguments made by a one-time commentator of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, a commentator on the very first show, that show that created a lot of waves in the martial arts world and pretty much started it all, the birth of mainstream mixed martial arts. So we'll be going back to that particular argument and look at what it means from a cultural and historical perspective. And I think it really does shine a light on the differing opinions of martial artists and what that meant in the early 1990s and what it means today. We'll give his particular argument, an argument made by a martial arts legend and luminary in his own right. We'll be giving that its own critical opinion, my critical opinion, that is. And so before we proceed, if you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to hit that bell, put a comment in there. I mean, make it a productive comment, please. Start a discussion or join in with the discussion. I'd love to hear your feedback on these particular shows and this particular subject. It's a big part of martial arts subculture and also in the self-defense discussion. So, obviously, please do hang around to the very end because there's important information coming up on the next show as well. And so now strap on your snorkel and all your diving gear. Let's go below the surface and check out those murky depths.
Before the existence of written records, humans systematized combat. From prehistory and into the modern day, martial arts have been a part of the fabric of culture and civilization. Whether as a means of self-protection or to wage war, or to compete, or to preserve a tradition, or to touch personal greatness, these codified methods push us to ask questions, to explore, to express, to test, and to tell stories. This is Jamie Club's podcast, the official podcast of Club Chimera Martial Arts, where we take the path of the vagabond warrior to find knowledge and inspiration from people, events, and ideas. If you are interested in where to follow Jamie Club and Club Chimera products and services, please wait until the end of the show. In the meantime, if you think this product is worth the price of a cup of coffee, please click on Support the Show in this episode's show notes.
Returning to our main story in the aftermath of the initial Brazilian Jiu Jitsu boom during the 1990s, the critics began circling ground fighting self-defense claims in general. There were clear problems with the original argument. Putting over the message that the majority of fights ended up on the ground was one thing, but actively seeking this range was another. The ground outside the training hall or competition area was unforgiving. Not only was it often occupied by a variety of objects that could easily cause injury, but in most cases it was hard enough to be used as a weapon in its own right, especially if you were the one fighting from your back. Even Desmond Morris had pointed out that fights on the ground were often prolonged, which naturally increased the risk of injury. Yet some BJJ programs taught to law enforcement and military were encouraging officers to unnecessarily hit the ground when drawing their firearms. Why would you seek this zone when fights could be finished from standing? Just as stand-up martial artists had offered the weak argument that a good striker shouldn't be bothered with ground fighting, so we saw a similar limiting view when some exponents of BJJ reinvented violence by saying that fighting more than one person was impossible and therefore shouldn't be addressed in training at all. Evidence to the contrary, showing standing defenders wading through or even knocking out multiple enemies, buries that particular argument with ease. There are countless case studies of individuals successfully fighting their way free of crowds of attackers. There are also those who have problems with the 90% statistic apparently taken from the 1988 LAPD report. Although I knew people involved in door supervision and security who supported this view, I also knew many others who didn't. The Rolling Around website cast a critical eye over the ground fighting propaganda and played devil's advocate. Michael Peachy took a random sample of 383 street fights shown on YouTube and noted that 69% of these fights did not end up on the ground. Peachy further noted of the 31%, only 41% resulted from a deliberate takedown, the others were from falling or being knocked to the ground. Peachy also examined the LAPD report. It turns out that the actual figure for incidents ending up on the ground was 62%. There was another thing that those who had quoted this source hadn't taken into consideration or neglected to mention. The 62% was concerning officers ending altercations by putting on handcuffs. Typically, when a suspect resists arrest, the police officer secures the individual using a joint lock, best administered on the ground, and then puts on the handcuffs. If we are to look at similar incidents involving immobilising an individual, such as in the context of prison guards restraining an aggressive inmate, the individual in question is often forced to the ground first. The context of arresting or restraining people is an altogether different dynamic to a civilian defending themselves from an assault. When questioned in the comments section, Peachy puts his hands up that the sampling wasn't perfect. Relevant points were made and he accepted that strike-based fights were more likely to be uploaded than grappling ones due to entertainment value, which has been borne out by the history of professional fighting. Mixed martial arts quickly discovered, as judo had done, that allowing unrestricted time limits on the ground is not appealing to a modern lay audience. Furthermore, the sample was typically going to come from people who were anticipating a fight rather than a spontaneous incident. This last point was particularly important to me, as I have long argued an assault and a street fight are not the same thing. Going by the stills and footage embedded in the article, many of these fights were consensual by nature. There might have been street fights with no agreed upon rules, but they weren't all assaults. This appears to be a key problem embedded in BJJ law since its earliest days. An assault and a counter-assault situation, much like the examples offered by arrest situations, present a different dynamic dictated by different objectives. I cover this on my Way of the Tiger Fearful Symmetry podcast. Nevertheless, Peachy's report reveals quite a different conclusion than what the Gracies and many others have been telling us about the way fights typically ended up. The conclusions he made also marries up to many other general observations that can be made about raw, unarmed combat. A month after Michael Peachy's report on the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu website rolling around, Jesse Encamp of the Karate Nerd would release a video featuring Bill Superfoot Wallace supposedly throwing more doubt onto Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Under the headings The Gracie Conspiracy and Gracie Fooled Everyone, Wallace would give his account of what went down in UFC 1 when the world was exposed to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and he was one of 3 commentators that night. The experience hadn't made him a fan. A column he wrote for Black Belt magazine following the first event condemned the competition, declaring it to be bad for martial arts. This resulted in a war of words when co-UFC owner Art Davey countered the article through Black Belt's letters page. During his interview with Jesse, Wallace was quite open about the fact that he didn't have a lot of faith in the show beforehand. He told the promoters that he didn't think the UFC was going to be popular due to the grappling element, and towards the end of his interview with Jesse, he happily confessed that he liked to kick. This, as we all know, is something of an understatement. For the purposes of this podcast, it is worth giving Wallace's comments a balanced review. He was not only present and involved with the event that launched the ground fighting argument for superiority as well as Brazilian Jiu Jitsu into the mainstream, but is also an influential voice that provides an opposing view to this argument, a view that came from the previous martial arts era. Looking at Bill Wallace's own career and style versus MMA, both then and now, it's not difficult to see the massive contrasts in aesthetics. Wallace is the American dream martial arts story. He is the tale of a man whose training was almost cut short when his dominant right leg had the ligaments torn in the knee during judo practice and then turned this disability to his advantage. He created a very distinctive style of fighting, earning himself the nickname Superfoot, which was suggested to him by his manager Don Keene at a basketball game when they were selling Superfoot long hot dogs. To the casual observer, Wallace's foundation, one might guess, was in Taekwondo or a similar style known for kicks, but it was Shorin-ryu karate, which Wallace says gave him the horse stance position he uses. Both point karate and his specific flavour of full contact karate that prohibited low kicks were the perfect fit for Wallace's balance of minimalism and spectacle. He only used 3 kicks and 3 punches from the one side, maintaining a single stance, but, to refer to the method and kicking philosophy chapters in my treasured 1987 edition of his The Ultimate Kick, he kicked his opponents even when they knew he was going to kick them, and also when he could have punched them. Wallace was a generation of sport karateka who believed in the value of full contact fighting, but also believed this should be represented by exciting, high-kicking action. This is pretty much the sport that the Professional Karate Association, the dominant force of kickboxing events in North America for the 1970s and 80s, promoted. It's interesting to note that the injury Wallace sustained that set him on the path and would earn him international fame and recognition as well as a lengthy undefeated reign in his chosen sport occurred in the grappling art. The first point made by Wallace in Jesse's interview was that, upon reflection, UFC 1 was a 2-hour advertisement for Gracie Jiu Jitsu. Wallace said he had a person behind him telling him what to say about Gracie Jiu Jitsu whenever Royce Gracie, Gracie Jiu Jitsu's representative fighter, competed. Wallace initially stopped before calling the entire event a conspiracy theory, but explains that the Gracies hand-picked the fighters and states quite a few peculiar decisions were made throughout the tournament. Despite conceding that Royce did a great job, Wallace inferred that a lot was being manipulated to put over the Gracie Jiu Jitsu brand. I don't think many people would be surprised by Bill Wallace's revelation that the first UFC was a thinly veiled promotion of Gracie Jiu Jitsu. After all, the show's co-creator and co-owner was Royce's brother, Rorion. The UFC had been born out of the promoting Rorion had done in California and the challenge matches he had held in his garage that attracted the attention of individuals like Art Davie. The first UFCs were as much an incarnation of the Gracie Challenge as it was Vale Tudo. UFC 1 was billed and pushed as the Battle of the Styles and a tournament with quote-unquote no rules. The Gracies had strongly declared that their style was the best for real fighting and were confident that this tournament would prove this assertion. As if to push this argument for stylism even further, Royce Gracie would be the tournament's smallest competitor. Without a doubt, UFC 1 was the most successful advertisement for Gracie Jiu Jitsu in the art's history, and that was Horion's clear intention from the beginning. However, the extent of how much the tournament was weighted in favour of a Gracie win is a far more contentious matter. The 2 referees for the first UFC were Gracie Jiu Jitsu black belts and currently both hold the rare grade of 9th Dan. Once again, this was not hidden information. Both men were prominent on the Vale Tudo TV scene and publicly promoted Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. We can agree that as part of the price for producing a spectacle that different martial artists would have the opportunity to test themselves and supposedly promote their art, they were going to have to do it in the spiritual progression of Horion's converted garage. There was also the added issue that few people outside of the Brazilian Vale Tudo scene or the Japanese shoot fighting scene knew how to run a virtual no-holds-barred contest. For all the talk of these underground death matches that have been created to bolster the careers of notorious fighters like Count Dante and Frank Dukes, few people had a clue how to actually manage something that came close to the real thing. Even the Vale Tudo familiar people involved were not prepared for how this event would run in the USA. The Gracie's involvement is public knowledge, and so is the fact that matters got very heated over the actual rules when fighters like Zane Frazier argued that not allowing fists to be wrapped stacked the deck in favour of Royce Gracie. To this, Rorion made the fair argument that people don't wrap their hands in street fights. Going by the footage and from what I can see, it would appear that some of the retrospective accounts of the UFC 1 are not entirely correct with regards to Kevin Rosier and Zane Frazier, as they both seem to have wrapped their hands, albeit they don't cover the knuckles. But Art Jimmerson wore a boxing glove for all the good it did him in his match against Royce. According to the No Holds Barred and Art Davie interview, 8-ounce gloves were specially acquired by Davie's younger brother when Jimmerson didn't pack any. He apparently went ballistic when he saw Jimmerson make his entrance sporting only one glove. On the other hand, Ken Shamrock was forbidden from wearing his wrestling shoes, and it could be argued that few street fights involve people not wearing shoes. We'll come to that point later. But in contradiction to this point, Art Davie said he was surprised that Jimmerson did not bring any boxing shoes. This was apparently rectified, and Jimmerson clearly wore them in his fight. Art Davie put out the advertisement and brought in the fighter shortlist. And yet again, footage reveals that Art Jimmerson also wrapped his hands, although it seems to be the trademark wrapping of the wrists with the knuckles being exposed, as can be seen on Art Jimmerson's right hand. Davie, and not Horian, was responsible for setting the card, and he apparently rejuggled the order several times as he guessed who would be the stronger fighters or how the matches would go. Davie was a businessman first and was interested in putting on a show. For example, he apparently believed Shamrock and Gracie to be the strongest fighters and did his best not to match them in the first round of the tournament. According to Gerard Gordeau, his reputation in shoot matches was suddenly hyped by the Japanese press when they learnt he would be competing, and this also stopped him from being paired with Hoist early on. Listed as representing Savat, although it was true Gordeau was a saboteur champion, his base system was really Kyokushin karate. However, he said he originally played this down knowing its hardcore reputation. Gordeau, a native of the Netherlands, was probably best described as a Dutch kickboxer. Art Davie later stated that he didn't want the final match to be grappler versus grappler, as this would have been the case if Shamrock had ended up fighting Hoist then, but rather a display of grappling versus striking. This is what would happen when Gordeau and Hoist finally met in the octagon. Although Gordeau concedes that Hoist was the better man on the night, he believed that he could have beaten him had they fought in the first match. Hoist, who would go on to win UFC 2's 16-man elimination tournament in UFC 4, gives Gordeau credit for being the calmest fighter on the night, but said it was just like fighting another stand-up fighter. In conclusion, UFC was conceived as a promotion for Gracie Jiu Jitsu, and given the lack of experience in the martial arts world of NHB competitions, it was largely arranged by the Gracies. Maybe there was a degree of creative juggling going on in the background to both ensure the best fights and to also give Hoist the best chance, but he legitimately won his fights. Furthermore, he came back to fight in the next 3 tournaments, winning 2 of them, and then agreed to fight Ken Shamrock in a super fight rematch. The subsequent UFCs largely answered any of the criticism thrown at the Gracies in the first 2 shows, no matter how valid. On Jesse Emkemp's video, Wallace then makes 2 points about the inclusion of sumo wrestler Tilia Tuli, a name that Art Davie helped change from the fighter's real name, Taylor Wiley, to make him sound more exotic. First, Wallace states the art was a bad fit for an enclosed sport of this nature, implying that Tuli was at a disadvantage from the get-go. Then he says the fight was stopped prematurely when the Gracie-friendly referee realised how tough Tuli was and speculated the Gracie game from underneath would have trouble handling the bulk of a sumo wrestler. It's interesting to note that although UFC co-owner Art Davie does not support Wallace's conspiracy theory, he does say he believed one of the Brazilian referees had an agenda that influenced the decision to stop the fight so quickly. He says this referee promoted a luta livre style event in Brazil and wanted to downplay striking. Davie also says this was the reason why the referees were not asked back after UFC 1. I find this claim very curious indeed, especially considering what we know about the feud between the Gracies and Luta Livre, which finished largely in the early 1990s, but still had a long history, and Luta Livre was not nearly as popular as Brazilian Jiu Jitsu at this particular stage, and why 2 very high-ranking Gracie Jiu Jitsu members would be involved in any sort of Luta Livre promotion. So it's rather an odd one, this particular claim, and I'd like to hear more about it. Tuli's match was over in 26 seconds. He rushed Gerard Gordeau into the fence only to fall over and be subjected to a round kick and a looping right to the face. The kick knocked out 3 of Tuli's teeth, 2 of which became lodged in Gordeau's foot, and the 3rd flew out of the octagon into anecdotal history. Clyde Gentry said it ended up under the judge's table, whereas other accounts say it disappeared into the audience. Bill Wallace says it sailed past his ear. Gracie team member and future referee Big John McCarthy said the tooth flew past his wife, encouraging her to announce, "That's it," and leave the show. Wallace argued that a sumo's main focus is to push someone out of the ring, which is completely negated by the presence of the cage. We should also remember that sumo matches can be won by having an opponent put anything but their feet on the ground. In this way, it's similar to Mongolian wrestling, so it's not just about having the ability to push an opponent out of the area. The decision to book a sumo wrestler for the UFC seems to be more influenced by spectacle than a belief that the confines of a caged arena would restrict them. The promoters wanted a huge and powerful competitor, and sumo often represents this extreme end of the martial arts world. Prior to the UFC, sumos were prominent figures in fantasy martial arts tournaments. Think Pamela of the 1988 movie Bloodsport. Future Jamie just jumping in here, and apparently Pamela was not representing sumo wrestling, as would be indicated by his name, I suppose. He was supposed to be a Polynesian fighter and was either representing Lua, which is a Hawaiian martial art, includes joint locks and bone breaking, or Lima Lama, which is a Samoan martial art. Or E Honda of the 1991 arcade game Street Fighter II. They were renowned for their fierceness, strength, and functional use of weight. Though it's true that a tearful and bloody Thule contested the decision to stop the bout, the video footage does not seem to support his belief that he would be okay to continue. Gordo had fed his seated opponent 2 damaging and unanswered strikes to the face. The sumo wrestler's gesturing for the fight to continue as the referee intervened might be seen as proof of his mettle, but also as evidence that he didn't realise how much danger he was in at the time. Thule, for all his resilience and courage, had shown zero defence once he fell over, and Gordo was clearly not taking any prisoners. The Dutch fighter's violent history and what he would go on to do in future MMA bouts does not fill the what-if thinker with much hope for the defenceless Thule. Besides, according to No Holds Barred, the decision to call the fight off was made by the show's doctor. However, it should be noted that Gerard Gordeau believed that this doctor was a member of Team Gracie. When he faced Hoyce in the final, he believes the doctor told the Brazilian fighter about his broken hand and subsequently squeezed it based on this information. Hoyce confirmed he could see it was swollen and didn't need to be told. Despite his interview with Sherdog on the 20th anniversary of UFC 1, Thule said he was heartbroken by his loss and had believed he could win the tournament. However, he then states that the fight was stopped by his brother, who threw in the towel, and says that, in hindsight, he was grateful this happened. Thule said he couldn't see properly at the time after Gordeau delivered the overhand right, and claims he would have tried to rip off his opponent's balls or tear out his throat in desperation at that point. Regardless of the allegiance of the referees, under the rules of UFC 1, they could not stop the bout. I have read reports that the referee disregarded this rule. According to Clyde Gentry, the doctor called the bout off, and according to Thule, who would have everything to gain to call the fight a fix, it was his brother who rightly stopped the fight. I might be wrong, but Wallace's foreboding of Thule's capabilities seems to marry up with a common view I've seen echoed by many influential martial artists of an earlier generation. The prolific and renowned martial arts writer Robert W. Smith, considered to be a leading authority in Asian martial arts, was among those of the old guard who held sumo in high esteem. In his 1999 book Martial Musings, Smith states no mixed martial artist, then commonly referred to as ultimate fighters, could stand against a middling sumo. He reminds readers that sumo also permits headbutts and several other strikes. Tila Thule's success record in sumo before the UFC was hardly that of a middling wrestler. Furthermore, his bad boy reputation had seen him be thrown out of several dojos. Just ahead of his fight in UFC 1, Thule claimed he had defeated 8 men single-handedly in a street fight. It's worth noting that Robert W. Smith was writing prior to the various scandals regarding sumo's institutionalized match fixing that dented some of the sport's fearsome reputation. This was also before Hoist Gracie's 2004 bout with Akebono Taro. Akebono had achieved the highest rank in sumo competition. He was a Yokozuna champion with a record that dwarfed Thule's. He also dwarfed Thule in physical stature and size, and twice had ample opportunity to put the Gracie guard to the sumo acid test. The second time saw Hoist tap Akebono with an omoplata shoulder lock wrist lock combination. So there you have it, far from a middling sumo, in fact one of the best in the sport, and in huge stature, fighting from the top position, but being also submitted whilst in that top position. Sumo was also back in UFC 3, featuring the late amateur sumo wrestler Emmanuel Yarbrough, the Guinness Book of Records heaviest athlete, who was defeated by Keith Hackney. Like Gordeau, Hackney's far heavier and bulkier opponent ended up on the ground eating strikes from his standing opponent. Bill Wallace was right in the respect that sumo was not and continues to not be a very good fit to MMA fighting, or any other combat sport outside of its own for that matter, but equally the awesome bulk of its representatives is not a significant threat to the highly skilled ground fighter. However, these fighters would be offered far more problems by more muscle-bound athletes such as strongmen and even bodybuilders. In this respect, Royce's Pyrrhic victory over Kimo Leopardo in UFC 3 would provide apt foreshadowing. Bill Wallace also says that Ken Shamrock argued against Royce Gracie, accusing the Jiu-Jitsuker of using his belt to submit him in their bout. The camera angles available make it very hard to see exactly how Royce tapped out Shamrock, but the official record is that Royce used a rear naked choke as his opponent went for an ankle lock at the same time in their match. Shamrock has officially contested that it was a gi choke, although he isn't sure on the exact details other than it felt like a rope around his throat. Even with the disadvantage of the poor angle in the available footage, it seems highly improbable the belt was used. The submission looks like it was achieved by rear naked choke, but until a better filming angle is made available, there is a possibility the gi was involved. Regardless of the details or what actually happened, both Shamrock and Wallace had issues with Royce being permitted to wear a gi. Almost a century after Gusto Gracie's wrestling fighter refused to wear a gi against his jiu-jitsuker opponent, the argument was somewhat reversed. Wallace rightly states that Royce Gracie was the only fighter wearing a gi in UFC 1. Shamrock claims he got tangled in the gi, which had led him to pull Royce into the dominant position. Shamrock's training team from Pancras, who had a lot more experience in this type of match than he did, were apparently livid that the UFC had prohibited their man from wearing wrestling shoes. Horian had argued that wearing shoes were the same as using a weapon, as they could increase the damage done by a kick. Shamrock, who would later state that this put him at a big disadvantage as he was unfamiliar with wrestling barefoot, would argue that a double standard was being set with the wearing of a gi, which could also be used as a weapon. Going back to Horian's row with Zane Frazier over the prohibition of hand wraps, one can see that he might have a point. The fight, which would kick off the first UFC feud, was not without other controversies. Shamrock was not only unfamiliar with fighting against an opponent in a gi, he said he wasn't used to fighting chokes, and he tapped immediately when Royce attacked with that technique. Royce released the hold, but the referee ordered them to fight on. It seems that Shamrock instinctively grabbed the ankle again, but Royce, resuming his position, said in his ear, "You tapped, Ken, you tapped." You can see Royce saying this in the footage. Some argue that Shamrock just paused rather than grabbed the ankle again. Whatever his reaction, he quickly admitted to the referee that he had submitted. This incident, and the fact that either the referee or Tully's brother stopped the previous match, seems to indicate that the claims against Gracie-friendly referees being biased during the tournament lack evidence. Although Royce was the only fighter wearing a gi in the first UFC, this would not be the case with the subsequent shows. UFC 2 would see both Remco Pardol and Ichihara Minoki donning gis in the octagon and prove that the attire offered at least as many disadvantages as it did advantages. Both of these fighters were submitted by lapel chokes, care of Royce. Pardot, although young and underrated, was also a highly experienced grappler. His background was judo and competitive Japanese jiu-jitsu, where he racked up an impressive number of victories. Christoph Lehninger appeared in UFC 3 wearing a gi, and with not only a prestigious background in judo but also 6 years exposure to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu via his business partner. None of it saved him from the returning Ken Shamrock's ground and pound onslaught. Shamrock would also get to wear his wrestling shoes this time. They'd also be present in UFC 5 in his much anticipated rematch against Royce in the first super fight. With no judges permitted in the UFC at the time and neither man knocked out or submitted, the rematch was declared a draw. Prior to this, in UFC 4, it should be noted that Keith Hackney provided more evidence of the dangers of the gi to its wearer by holding Royce's jacket with one hand and throwing strikes with the other. Bill Wallace also remarked that a very good boxer had declared himself asthmatic and requested no smoke machine for his entrance in UFC 1, but this had been ignored and the fighter subsequently struggled to breathe during his fight. Art Jimmerson was the only fighter representing boxing as an art, so it seems that not much reading between the lines or Sherlockian deduction is required here, although several other fighters had experience in this sport, with Kevin Rosier being both a professional boxer and a professional kickboxer. if it was Jimmerson who made this request that was intentionally ignored, it is difficult to see evidence of him gassing out during his single fight of the night where he lost to Royce Gracie. Jimmerson is often unfairly regarded as an illegitimate fighter in hindsight of his UFC appearance. It has been said, or at least implied, that he fought in the tournament out of desperation when his boxing career took a nosedive. This doesn't stack up too well against the facts. He had a respectable pedigree of 29 wins and 5 losses at the time. He hadn't lost a fight in 5 years, coming off a string of 15 straight wins, and was scheduled to face one of the great 4 kings of the 80s middleweight division, Thomas the Hitman Hearns, 1 month after UFC 1. Although Jimmerson might have been totally unfamiliar with grappling, at least at this level, he had experience fighting an exhibition bout with the world-class kickboxer Don the Dragon Wilson. To give the UFC credit, they wanted a ranked professional boxer, but were struggling to find anyone willing to take the risk in their career with this type of event. Jimmerson didn't need the money and had concerns about career-ending injuries. However, he was initially offered a guaranteed 10 times and then 20 times the amount a first-round tournament competitor was supposed to receive just for turning up to the fight. It's very important that boxing, being by far the world's most popular spectator combat sport and having such strong cultural heritage in the USA, received good representation at an event that was being billed as the Battle of the Styles. Jimmerson's decisive loss, where he didn't throw a single punch in the fight, seems to have nothing to do with his excellent athletic condition and everything to do with the bubbles that martial arts subculture creates. When we tend to think of such bubbles and naivety to fighting, we think of deluded martial artists with no genuine combat experience getting swiftly and brutally schooled by full contact fighters. However, Jimmerson's story provides us with insight into how much being blinkered in any single art, no matter how effective and proven in full contact, with little to no practical experience to other systems of fighting can put one at a disadvantage. Jeff Thompson and other practical martial arts rebels at the time, even with a huge amount of experience in grappling arts, placed the modern version of this combat sport at the top of their attribute training list to reinforce self-defense. However, this is largely due to the asymmetrical nature of a sniper-style attack. During the first split second, having fast, powerful, accurate hand strikes can make the world of difference to thwart an imminent assault. Having said that, Jeff and some other aligned members of the 90s reality revolution freely admit that should any fight become prolonged, an individual schooled in effective pressure-tested clinching and ground fighting has a huge advantage. The nature of match fights, of which the UFC, Vale Tudo and other NHB or near NHB contests elevate to an elite level, favour those who can handle fights that last longer than a few seconds. For a start, none of them begin at conversation range, but rather in the familiar large open space approach as the two combatants circle and gauge, finding their range. Jimmerson says he was surprised when Royce made his entrance and the audience erupted into cheers, realising he had blindly stepped into another world. There was no cheering squad for the boxer other than his corner. This was the Gracie's domain. Having said that, Jimmerson has never really condemned the UFC for setting him up. I've yet to find an interview from him or a source other than Bill Wallace that describes him as an asthmatic or having any problems with the smoke machine that night. By his own admission, Jimmerson was totally unprepared for UFC 1. He makes no accusations of a conspiracy other than some propaganda spoken to him via the Brazilian referee and Big John McCarthy, who apparently showed him how quickly he could be taken down. To be fair to him, there have been plenty of examples of trained professional boxers easily destroying their bare-knuckle equivalents in novelty bouts. This is usually a reflection on the quality time and experience a professional puts into a sport that has been a genuine full-time vocation for countless numbers of people worldwide for an entire century, versus an undeniably tough athlete who nevertheless isn't engaged in his sport as his main source of income. Although I hasten to add, the sport of bare-knuckle fighting is certainly evolving at an alarming rate, producing some very top-level fighters, and we are beginning to see more defeats of people who were previously boxing champions, pro boxing champions, actually getting defeated in the bare-knuckle world. So, it's just a sign of maybe how things are changing, but just watch this space. Jimmerson, a paid professional, probably saw this collection of men from minority and amateur sports to be little different than the weekend warriors of tough men competitions at best. Going by his interview, he doesn't seem to have taken the event seriously, thinking it would be a real-life version of the Street Fighter II arcade game. Just prior to his fight with Royce Gracie, the boxer had been shocked by the brutality of the previous two bouts. A nonchalant Gerard Gordeau smoking a cigarette, patiently waiting for his next fight, whilst two of Tully's teeth remained embedded in his foot and his hand was clearly broken in several places. Kevin Rosier popping back in his clearly broken jaw, whilst his opponent Zane Frazier was being stretchered off to hospital. The huge pop for Royce Gracie's entrance ahead of his comparatively insignificant amount of vocal support couldn't have been the greatest psychological immediate sequel to these scenes for the boxer wearing the one borrowed glove. Jimmerson believed his jab would be enough to fend off and set up any grappler with his superior footwork. Royce fought as a southpaw to Jimmerson's orthodox stance because most grapplers fight with their strong side forward. He often used a low kick in a manner similar to a Nakmoy's low teep, which Jimmerson was not used to. Harking back to his previous style versus style experience, Don Wilson's version of kickboxing was of the Bill Wallace PKA brand that forbid low kicks. This was a more subtle example of Jimmerson's lack of preparation for the fight. He recalls Royce setting up the shoot by raising his hands up high, which was a classic trick Gracie's used against stand-up fighters of the time. It worked. Royce shot in, got to the mount position, and then immediately threw a headbutt in true NHB I ain't playing fashion. Apparently Jimmerson's team had said they would pull him out the second there was any trouble, and true to their word, they threw in the towel when it went down. The towel got caught on the fence and the referee didn't see it. However, Jimmerson didn't take long to tap, which surprised the referee, who asked him if he wanted to continue, but he didn't. Jimmerson confesses to being put on the ground, and fighting there was an entirely new experience for him. There is the possibility that Bill Wallace was referring to the aforementioned Zane Frazier, who lost to Rosier and had to be stretchered out due to his asthma. Zane Frazier shares the unique position of both being the only fighter that was personally recommended by Rory and Gracie, and also the most vocally oppositional to him during the infamous rules meeting. During the special 20th anniversary reviews of UFC 1, run by Sherdog, Frazier gave a view that pretty much supported Wallace's argument, yet does not marry up with the specific details regarding the smoke machine. Horian had first seen and met Frazier at a full-contact karate match where the American Kempo representative had been disqualified for brawling with his opponent. He had supposedly been impressed that a karate man could take another fighter down in the then less familiar ground and pound way. Frazier says that although he had been selected, he and all other fighters had been asked to send in video evidence of their abilities, but he had refused to do so, having heard from an inside source that the Gracies were using the footage to eliminate potential threats to their representative in the UFC. Art Davey had gone to watch him compete at a martial arts expo, but didn't need to wait for the scheduled fight to make his decision. Frazier had got into a brawl with Frank Dukes, resulting in them both being handcuffed by the LAPD. Having seen Frazier dominate the man who had been the basis for the 1988 Jean-Claude Van Damme career vehicle Bloodsport, where Dukes had claimed to have been the champion of a secret no-holds-barred multi-style tournament, Davey was convinced he should fight in the UFC. Frazier's view supports Wallace's claim the entire event was set up to promote Gracie Jiu Jitsu and that the tournament was slanted in favour of their man. He says that up until the night of the fight he was being fed all sorts of tall tales about how the bouts were going to take place. Not allowing the wrapping of hands was one thing, but Frazier also claims that he had been spied upon when training and other rules were being put forward in reaction to handicap him. A scorch mark on Frazier's shoulders came from training against multiple opponents on a tarmac surface when he was told that the ground wouldn't even be matted. Frazier said he trained for the event as if it were a street fight because this is the story that Horan had fed him ever since they had met. However, Frazier did not complain about the smoke machine. In fact, he says that although he had suffered respiratory failure in a previous fight that year at a World Karate Championship, this was something he was hiding from the fight promoters, and he also didn't know he was asthmatic until after his UFC 1 fight. He adds that, despite the event being in favour of the Gracies, he could not take anything away from Royce's work or the fact that all the Gracies were undeniably tough fighters. Wallace claims the martial arts selected were generally stand-up fighters and totally unprepared for double-leg takedowns, groundwork and grappling in general. Please forgive my nitpicking here, but I'm also mindful of the fact that Rosier, Frazier, Jimmerson and Patrick Smith were all born and bred US citizens, meaning they would likely have had a fair amount of basic experience in scholastic wrestling. Unfortunately, there isn't readily available information on any of these fighters' high school or college backgrounds, but wrestling has been a nationwide standard part of boys' physical education in the US for most of the 20th century. Despite its place in middle school and high school, it has a reputation for being an extremely tough sport, as does its collegiate counterpart, although that version is considered to be more technical. Without much in the way of information on their early years in sports, it isn't a wild bet to guess that all three men were good at sports. This would mean they spent a fair amount of time wrestling during those formative teenage years, and might even have got on the teams. It's speculation, but food for thought. In the UK, Wallace's remarks are far more relatable. Despite our rich cultural and traditional wrestling heritage, we Brits and our Irish neighbours haven't ever readily adopted any form of grappling into our education system. However, this is not the case in the US, and Wallace, who definitely trained wrestling in high school, would have known this fact. Perhaps he didn't believe it to be significant, and I'm niggling. But I think it has some place in the conversation. Anyway, if all the fighters selected were pulled from stand-up arts, then Ken Shamrock was a clear exception, and to a certain extent, so was Telia Tuli. Gerald Gordeau had fought in a supposedly legitimate MMA bout in 1988, and Zane Frazier claims that not only did his Kempo karate always have ground and pound in its syllabus, but he also had experience training with the legendary judoka and wrestler Gene LaBelle, as well as the Machados. So, full confession here, this is barrel scraping in my attempts to find any wrestling backgrounds on the three stand-up participants mentioned. When I looked at Kevin Rosier, there was nothing on any of his high school background, although given the discussions online about his size and how he quickly went into security work, I think it's a fair guess that he definitely would have been involved in wrestling. Obviously, it's a fair presumption that any boy in the US would have had some wrestling training, and especially someone who was naturally athletic. In 1987, interestingly, he was the United States Kung Fu Karate National No Rules Tournament champion. So what that no rules meant, Art Jimison attended University City High School in Missouri. And again, there's only some sort of hearsay information on his wrestling background, although, of course, it's highly likely that he did, just generated from an AI report that came back that's taken information from a Reddit discussion with somebody who said that they'd talked to Art Jimison, and he confirmed that he had wrestled at high school. When we think of the event as being a glamorised version of the Gracie Challenge, it's easier to get one's head around who fought that night and what happened. Art Davey had put the idea of a tournament to Horry and Gracie about a promotional concept. Most of those attendants, from commentators like Bill Wallace to the fighters to the general public, were unprepared for the night's events, and that was often the case with the Gracie Challenge. No other martial artist had so aggressively pushed an argument of this nature beyond grandstanding one-off novelty bouts and fantasy tales of death matches. Since the 1970s, the international martial arts world had exploded and installed itself into leisure culture. However, this was a highly fragmented and divisive world, with their own borders and dogma, ensuring the landscape looked more like busy suburbia than a fluid utopian plain of intermingling knowledge-based communities. Now a myriad of different arts competed for attention in the mainstream, and each had created their own subculture and industry. Cross-pollination had occurred in stand-up fighting competition with the semi-contact and point sparring world, essentially creating their own sport format that many Japanese, Okinawan, Chinese and Korean-style martial artists had settled into since the 1960s. Kickboxing was the only sport that was willing to challenge other arts, with Americans and European stylists appreciating the low kicks of Muay Thai by the end of the 1980s. The Nak Muays of Thailand was somewhat comparable to the Brazilian Jiu Jitsukas in that they showed a consistent willingness to fight anyone, and their time during this showed. Nak Muays had a better grasp of blending all their ranges than the hybrid arts they faced. Their bouts were restricted to the stand-up range, but they inspired the genesis of Dutch kickboxing, Japanese kickboxing, thanks in part to their devastating leg kicks. The Thais also had regular matches against Chinese Sanda boxers and held an annual competition in neighbouring Myanmar where they fought Lethwei fighters under their own pre-1930s rules, which permitted headbutts and also fought without boxing gloves. In hindsight, the UFC 1 fights might have been different with the inclusion of world-class judoka and wrestlers, and such issues would be addressed in future events. To give credit to the Gracies, regardless of the way their infomercial was set up, Hoist legitimately beat his opposition in the early days. He fought others who wore gis, and he fought a legitimate wrestler in the form of Dan Severn in UFC 4. There's also a lot of naivety among people who do not put on professional events, especially those featuring different people from a wide array of different culture disciplines. Again, I cite growing up in show business and especially my family's experience in circus and professional variety show culture to show my empathy for any promoter who's trying to bring together so many disparate arts in one event. Ask any large-scale festival event organiser what it's like to negotiate contracts with so many people who have no allegiance to one another and prepare for some stressful anecdotes. The fighters assembled in the early UFCs were fair representations of the martial arts scene, and the results undeniably created a massive paradigm shift. Going back to Machado's shark metaphor, it's interesting to note that in 1975 Steven Spielberg's adaptation of Peter Benchley's pulp thriller Jaws quickly elevated the species of marine life high on the fear chart. Can we stretch things and compare the emotional reaction the general public had to sharks, thanks to Jaws, to the way ground fighting impacted martial arts subculture, thanks to the early UFCs? Based on Jaws alone, countless numbers of people became wary of the sea. The movie was the first summer blockbuster, and I rank it as one of the greatest horror movies ever made. I know it far exceeds that genre, but few other horror films have retained the scares or have inspired as much fear as Jaws. Since it broke box office records, there have been a ridiculous number of imitators. The film's direct influence can be seen in virtually every drama that features a threat from some form of wildlife since 1975, and even less obvious horrors like 1979's seminal classic Alien, which was originally pitched as Jaws in Space. By 2016, young children across the world were getting acquainted with a dance craze inspired by a song called Baby Shark. Preschool teachers and children's entertainers everywhere happily took children through the hand movements that mimic the jaws of a family of hunting sharks. This traditional campfire song, with unclear origins, had been adopted and reproduced by an educational company called Pink Fong, who introduced it with bars from Antonin Dvorak's Symphony No. 9, a thinly veiled attempt to imply John Williams' famous score from Jaws without incurring any copyright infringement. The fear now seems to have been reduced to a nursery song. When I was a child, I recalled one of my comic books, Buster, featuring a strip called Gums that concerned the misadventures of a toothless shark. Familiarity appeared to have bred some degree of contempt. Now, there are so many laughable and laughably bad shark movies that you can watch entire YouTube videos called Top 50 Shitty Shark Movies. More education on sharks is now widely available, and better research has been done on them since the early hysteria. The rarity of shark attacks on humans is regularly promoted. Nevertheless, amid the continued stream of bad Jaws-inspired movies and spoofs, there will be a genuinely scary drama featuring sharks. Shark documentaries still rank among the most popular natural history programs on television, and a good portion of these shows focus on the shark's strong placing as an apex predator. So I ask, has Brazilian Jiu Jitsu submission fighting and ground fighting lost most of its teeth, or are some fighters more respectful about falling overboard? The mainstream view of mixed martial arts is totally different today than it was in 1993. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu remains a permanent part of an average fighter's training background. Most of the champions in the different divisions have black belts in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. However, over time, the ground has become a less inevitable range than it once seemed. I've seen fights with two Brazilian Jiu Jitsu black belts fully expecting a technical ground game, only to find myself watching a kickboxing and clinch fest. As with any combat sport, the rules have greatly influenced the game. However, changes were already taking place during the 1990s outside of the UFC. The International Vale Tudo Championship was an attempt to make Vale Tudo a mainstream event in Brazil again from 1997 to 1999. By 1997, the UFC's attempts to reform the sport were more visible, with weight categories introduced in February of that year's UFC 12, the mandatory wearing of gloves by July's UFC 14, and major rule changes by October's UFC 15 that banned hair-pulling, headbutts, strikes to the back of the head, and knee strikes to downed opponents. Attacks to the groin are also listed as now officially prohibited again. They were banned in the first UFC, but then unbanned in UFC 2. UFC 4 witnessed Keith Hackney repetitively smashing his fist into Joe Son's groin to release a guillotine choke on the ground. The larynx crush Hackney used to submit Son is also now no longer legal in MMA. I hasten to add, if you feel any sympathy for the fate of Joe Son in this match, it is worth knowing that the man is currently serving a sentence for being part of a gang rape and torture of a woman on Christmas Eve that occurred 4 years prior to this fight. Some might now consider Hackney's brutal onslaught to be a mild degree of pre-justice for this individual. By the end of the 20th century, the UFC introduced rounds and the format for mainstream MMA was, more or less, established. There are now 31 fouls recognised by the state licensing authority. The International Vale Tudo Championship could be seen as a direct reaction to these big shifts in the UFC, appealing to those who wish to continue the vision laid out by Rorion Gracie's UFC. However, they did implement one crucial rule: 30-minute time limits on all matches. Time limits have been enforced since UFC 4 ran over its allotted 2-hour pay-per-view slot, robbing viewers of the last crucial minutes of the tournament's final match. This had been one of the main reasons why Rorion Gracie had sold his shares of the company after UFC 5, despite the fact there were time limits and judges in UFC 1, plus there was even intended rounds, as can be seen in the final match, where there is a round 1 title card on the screen. Listening to several of the competitors from the first event, a fair amount of strategy was being placed on the time limits. Art Jimmerson was hoping to use his jab and footwork to keep Royce at bay for 5 minutes, and Zane Frazier was planning to hold on to Kevin Rosier when he began to gas out during their match until the end of the 5-minute round. Rorion had also been angered that in the 36-minute super fight between his brother Royce and Ken Shamrock at UFC 5, Art Davey had instructed referee John McCarthy to stand the two fighters up after a lengthy period on the ground that was attracting boos from the audience. This executive decision, made on the spot during a fight, became a new rule enforced in UFC 6 and would lead to time limits on ground fighting. Rorion, in line with the beliefs of Elio's school of Gracie Jiu Jitsu, did not believe in time limits and had seen the UFC as a means for educating people in the importance of their art. However, not even the newly televised Vale Tudo could go along with this, and one might recall the demise of professional catch wrestling as a spectator sport, leading to its mutation into work sports entertainment, was signalled by the 5.5-hour snooze fest between Ed Strangler Lewis and Joe Stretcher that resulted in a draw. Regardless, and even with the time limits, the International Vale Tudo Championship ceased promoting the old brand of MMA in 1999. Despite promotions like Rio Heroes and Fin Fight, which still permitted headbutts, the UFC's evolved unified rules would become the prevailing force of MMA. Nevertheless, what these non-UFC bouts did show that was, despite the lack of rules, the style of fighting on the show was taking the same shape as the mainstream version. Less fights were going to the ground now, and striking was back in vogue. What had happened? If Brazilian Jiu Jitsu might be considered the shark, then perhaps wrestling is the orca. The arrival of Olympic standard wrestlers changed things a lot. As it stands, the largest percentage of UFC champions had freestyle wrestling as their own core discipline, although some have argued the tide is turning against wrestling at the moment. Watch this space. We now can roughly divide MMA fighting up into 3 ranges: stand-up, clinch and ground. If boxing, kickboxing and Muay Thai represent the stand-up range and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu has the ground, then wrestling controls the strong link between the two, the clinch. The experienced clincher smothers and ties up the stand-up fighters and controls the takedown, often establishing a very powerful top position if the fight does go to the ground. Strikers have been able to build off the wrestler's range, learning how to use dirty boxing techniques in close. Sprawl and brawl and ground and pound are both tactics stemming from, or at least been refined by, wrestlers. There are many who have even called into question Gracie propaganda regarding leverage versus strength. Elio Gracie and his son Royce are often the poster boys for their art because they demonstrated the Bruce Lee, David and Goliath ideal that small could beat big if small was clever. The Gracie Challenge's philosophy was heavily invested in promoting the art and the style over individual athletes. Both Rorion and Royce contend that this was the reason why Royce fought in the UFCs and not Hickson, rather than the fraternal feuding that others have claimed. Although the sumo theory seems to have been soundly countered, it's worth noting that not just wrestlers but muscle-bound opponents in general have given Brazilian Jiu-Jitsuka the most trouble. In recent times, a 5 times world's strongest man, Mariusz Pudzianowski, knocked out 4th degree black belt Holmes Gracie within seconds of their opening round. Pudzianowski's lack of martial arts training in general is a sobering reminder to many trained fighters of what can be achieved through attitude, simplicity and raw ability. Nevertheless, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu tournaments have traditionally kept an open weight division, and the Vale Tudo they promoted, as seen with the early UFCs, had no weight restrictions. We have seen many examples of much smaller and lighter fighters beat larger opponents, although weight and strength will always be unavoidably big factors that decide fights regardless of the range. I still contend that the ground offers more opportunities for a lighter fighter than what might be offered in stand-up and clinch. The fact that the real art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is shown from their work in the guard, a position that is concerned with fighting from underneath, is an active demonstration of what can be achieved when gravity is against you. It's not really a question whether Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has lost its teeth, so much as the fact that the game has evolved and continues to evolve. MMA is no longer a battle of styles, if it ever was, but now the development of a combat sport that also continues to evolve, providing a rich area of attribute training for other martial artists. This brings us to the question of self-defense. Before the critics of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu became vocal, there were influential and pioneering people in the world of self-defense and combatives who felt a need to warn against ground fighting. This was probably because of the instinctive fears I spoke about in the previous episode, as well as the presence of judo and wrestling. We covered two of these in the previous episode, who were contemporaries of the emerging grappling sports, Walter Armstrong and Andrew Newton. However, here are the words of a more famous luminary who specifically focused on self-defense. In his 1942 book, Get Tough, All in Fighting, the great William Fairbairn said, quote, "No holds or locks on the ground are demonstrated. The reason for this is A. This is war. Your object is to kill or dispose your opponent as quickly as possible. B. Once on the ground, you are more vulnerable to attack. It is therefore obvious that you should concentrate on remaining on your feet." End quote. One might equally say that learning unarmed combatives is pointless in war because battles have been decided by weapons for over 10,000 years. This isn't to be dismissive of Fairbairn's sentiment. The highly experienced Royal Marine and police officer was keen to keep his soldiers and officers off the ground and not to be tempted into ground fighting when it could be avoided. He probably felt a need to put over this point due to the international proliferation of judo, jiu-jitsu and wrestling in self-defense books and articles since the late 19th century. Perhaps the words of boxing enthusiast millionaire Colonel Anthony J. Drexel Biddle in his 1937 Do or Die supplementary manual on individual combat for the US Marine Corps offers more succinct advice, quote, "Stay on your feet." End quote. Years later, another pioneer, Rex Applegate, would somewhat add to this in his 1962 book Kill or Get Killed, quote, "Avoid, if at all possible, going to the ground with your adversary." End quote. This last sentence is something I can get behind. A decade before Applegate's book, the much overlooked 1952 Cold Steel of John Stiers features a single image of symmetrical ground fighting with the author applying a rear naked choke. As a side note, Stiers' book deserves to be in most self-protection teachers' archives. Although it is clearly focused on training soldiers in close-quarter combat with a heavy emphasis on weapon-on-weapon fighting, Stiers' approach is totally proactive, and that involves teaching the preemptive strike. This is extremely rare, as his work was produced sandwiched somewhere between more popular works promoting a "wait for your attacker to do this so you can do this" strategy to survive a violent attack. Outside of judo and catch wrestling, other self-defense books of the first half of the 20th century, such as boxer Jack Dempsey's How to Fight Tough, based on his time working with the US Coast Guard's jiu-jitsu teacher in World War II, had some rather idealistic finishes on the ground. I often remember as a child enjoying many of the vintage animated cartoons, and it was not uncommon to see characters bending back a leg of a grounded enemy. This was the sort of thing that had been popping up in more comprehensive martial arts manuals since the Edwardian era of E. Barton Wright's Bartitsu. Although Bartitsu was not successful in catching on, its creator should be credited for his promotion of cross-training and also for bringing over some influential jiu-jitsu teachers. However, part of Barton Wright's legacy is the image of reactive-based self-defense fighting that never went to the ground. This became the norm for subsequent self-defense programs, systems and many martial arts. Think of the one-step sparring that emerged in karate during the early 20th centuries. Up until the 1990s, formal mainstream self-defense, even when it was being taught by judo teachers, often consisted of highly reactive scenarios. Ground fighting, if it was addressed, was provided as a short footnote or took the form of some brief idealistic escapes. However, before this view of reactive stand-up only self-defense emerged within its stylistic and tribal bubble of prejudice, assumption and wishful thinking, there were some historic self-defense teachers who would have made a difference if dominant tastes hadn't obscured them in the mists of time. Rough and tumble was a title bestowed upon a type of no-holds-barred competition fought out in the US. This informally institutionalized sport had its roots in the American colonies of the 18th century and reached its heights in the 1870s when New York newspapers reported on these organized brawls. Rough and tumble appears to be one of these cultural phenomenons that is only known about through the eyes of observers, who in virtually all cases speak of it in disparaging tones. No primary source books or articles have been uncovered regarding the teaching of this form of fighting. It provides us with another example of the way dominant and influential tastes in society kept ground fighting's potential away from self-defense instruction. The great duelist and cross-training martial arts teacher Colonel Monstery came across these bouts during their heyday. This Danish-born but American nationalized adventurer's primary unarmed combat style was Western boxing, but he was not above bringing in kicks from French savate, English purring or the universal tactic of headbutting. Monstery's clients were gentlemen, and well ahead of his time, ladies. Although he clearly had a bias towards duelling, and much of his treatise, as all others of the 19th and previous centuries, is influenced by the concept of match fighting, Monstery was clearly concerned might face a rough-and-tumble fighter. Monstery sensibly advocates a strong and effective striking policy and to avoid grappling with these fighters. He also advises that anyone who will likely be among rough company to keep their hair short. He believed a quote-unquote right-hand full-arm blow would quote-unquote stop almost any grappler, and advocated a quote-unquote rear leap to keep a distance. It's interesting to note a prevailing idea that footwork and hard striking were enough to handle grapplers. We just saw it in Art Jimerson's pre-UFC fight plans. Monstery's only recorded fights with a rough-and-tumble fighter resulted in a very rare loss when his opponent, a man called Bliss, tried to gouge him. Credit to the Colonel, the event inspired him to enlist the help of a man with rough-and-tumble fighting experience to teach at his school. If only more self-defense teachers had taken a leaf out of Monstery's book. Well, there was at least one individual who might be seen something of Monstery's successor. Jean-Joseph Renard, the French playwright and journalist, first came to my attention when martial arts writer and historian Graham Noble wrote an article on self-defense books of the turn of the 20th century. Renard stands out from all contemporaries in the way he actively promotes martial arts cross-training. His 1912 Defense of the Street stands out from virtually every book written on self-defense for the majority of the 20th century. He not only made interesting reviews of the various different martial arts being taught at the time, he notes the benefits of English boxing for self-defense over American are quite interesting, but he actively promoted preemptive striking over the more reactive-based training of his era. He also encouraged cross-training, which, although had always been going on, would not be popularised until decades later. Furthermore, he taught and incorporated ground fighting, acknowledging the reality that some fights did go to the ground, and it was imperative to understand what to do there. In an attempt to learn from our past mistakes, we should be wary of fashionable tastes, idealism and prejudice. We should also observe where these mistakes stem from and can become institutionalised in our training. Teaching an individual to avoid grappling in high-risk situations is sound advice. Strike-based fights are typically finished faster than those involving grappling. Distance is the friend of the civilian trying to avoid getting hurt and getting home. Strikes are the ally of disengagement once the in-fight stage is on. However, grappling is the most primal form of unarmed combat known to virtually all mammals, and it is deep within our instincts. To think that this can always be overridden, or that strikes will always work alone against a clinching antagonist, is naive in the extreme. Somewhere the wise words of avoidance became combined with the desire to not face certain realities and possibilities. Our fighting systems became infected by logical fallacies. I used to teach anti-grappling before I taught combat grappling on the assumption that these instincts would be enough for civilians to build effective disengagement tools and a means for getting back to striking range. Experience teaching people over time, and especially teaching other teachers, has informed me that this is naive. In order to anti-grapple, as Matty Evans once told me, you need to know how to grapple. The tactile awareness provided by grappling practice is a crucial attribute skill that deserves time in even a basic self-defense course. There is much to be learned from the wrestler, and if I could have my time back again, I would spend more of it learning these disciplines properly. Hoist Gracie rightfully said at the time of the first UFC, judo and wrestling were not recognised in the martial arts subculture as martial arts. They had little to no presence in the magazines. If there was one good thing that came out of those early UFC days, it was the respect it brought back to those grappling arts, especially those grappling combat sports, and their place in combat training. Regardless of the dynamics of the match fight or the counter-assault situation, knowledge of the clinch should be a control measure on any combat risk assessment. As mixed martial artists learnt, these skills are the ones needed to stop the fight going to the ground and, if required, access striking range. Mid-level and low-level threats as well as arrests can benefit hugely from experience gained from defending takedowns and controlling stand-up grappling positions. However, we have to respect that the ground is possible. Walls and the determination of fighters to remain standing might counter Desmond Morris and the Gracie's assertions that most fights will end up on the ground, but still a good proportion of fights do end up there. Assaults can begin there too. Think of home invasions and attempted date rape situations amongst many other common scenarios that might not even begin with the victim standing. Skills developed through the experience of ground fighting are not restricted to pinning or fighting from underneath. They include a lot of work fighting from kneeling and seated postures, and even more importantly, they teach transitioning. Transitions are one of the most overlooked areas of self-defense training and martial arts in general. This is why good boxing coaches spend so much time developing footwork. Movement is a big part of fighting and self-defense. It deserves far more attention than it often receives. Ironically, although we have Brazilian Jiu Jitsu teachers refusing to address multiple attack situations and even going so far as to say demonstrably false statements like it's impossible to fight off more than one person, their ground movement and transitioning provide excellent means for safely escaping attackers in an asymmetrical multiple attack ground situation. A lot of damage is accumulated by the grounded victim trying to get back to their feet. Thoughts of actual fighting often leave the victim's mind as they try to concentrate on getting back to their feet. It's fair comment from my historic teachers to tell us to stay on our feet or get back to our feet as quickly as possible, but when you're on the ground, you need an efficient means to get back up. Keeping in line with a proactive attitude and approach, these postures and transitions need to be counterattacks rather than just defensive positioning. You need to train to fight from every conceivable position whilst getting to a stronger place. In this case standing, and you need to be able to move in an effectively aggressive manner that will dissuade your enemy from further attacks. This training needs to be isolated and pressure tested before being integrated into the larger picture if you want a comprehensive system of self-defense that better prepares its students. The ocean is a rich and fascinating place for exploration. Its vast expanse provides something of an alpha and omega of our existence. We came from it, and some of our fellow animals, such as the whales, return to it. The place is full of danger too. To paraphrase my favourite comedian Billy Connolly, we spent millions of years trying to leave the sea. Why would we want to return? We're not welcome. There are things in there that bite us. Although I can't agree totally with his sentiments, having a love for the beach and taking regular advantage to heal and play whenever I get an opportunity to swim, I can see where he's coming from. Likewise, the ground is the place we all crawled up from as a species and within the microcosm of our lifespan. We embraced it in the roughhousing of our childhood play. Well, my generation did anyway. Martial artists like Brazilian Jiu Jitsuers, through the medium of their own sport or mixed martial arts competitions, have acted like all the many people who spend their time sailing the sea or diving deep into the depths. They've uncovered a sophisticated system and continue to discover more. However, within the context of life, we have to understand when it is time to surface. This concludes The Way of the Shark. Stick around after these messages for information on what's up next. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're so inclined, there are many ways you can express your support and help keep this podcast going. For example, I've published several books on Amazon. If you'd like a signed copy of any of them, please drop me an email. You can also purchase my online Vagabond Warriors martial arts cross-training courses and the online Animal Instincts Children's Self-Protection Teaching Program. More direct support can be shown through Buy Me a Coffee and my Patreon page. I'm most grateful to all those who have already bought my books and courses and those who continue to kindly donate to the show. As for my services, the heart of all that is CCMA, nowadays I teach private lessons, courses and seminars. These are bespoke services that put you in charge of your martial arts journey. I teach self-protection and martial arts cross-training. You can train with me, one-to-one, or in a small group. I count individual clients, couple clients, parent and child clients, and various other combinations. These can be taught face-to-face or virtually. I also regularly teach clubs, societies and associations nationally and internationally. Please go to clubchimera.com for more details. Please don't forget to subscribe to this show on whatever podcast platform you are currently using. If you could leave me a 5-star rating and a review, I would be most grateful. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, X and TikTok. Facebook also has a members group in addition to the main business page, so please send in a request to join in with the training discussions and be a part of the wider CCMA community. I'm also uploading new content to YouTube. There are various shorts, vlogs and full video versions of some of these podcast episodes on there. Again, please subscribe, like, share and leave a comment. All favourable engagement helps keep CCMA moving forward. According to the late great cosmologist Stephen Hawking, chaos, when left alone, tends to multiply. And that might be the case on the scheduling for this year's podcast. If you thought that our sights would now be set on sunny Phuket and the art of Muay Thai, then you might be in for a shock. We'll be shifting our attention away from combat sports and to self-protection, but it will be another dark dive. This time, not only are we looking at our own irrational fears, but also at the darkest parts of the human character. You see, we are now approaching our annual Halloween episode, and that means we are to return to the Ballad of Eagle.